Balfour succeeded his uncle Lord Salisbury as Prime Minister, but it was initially believed that he was not interested in politics. Fortunately for him, the Liberals were still split over colonialism and the Boer War, which had just ended. So his Conservatives held power, and most importantly, after years of brewing tensions with Germany, he formed the Entente Cordiale with the French, and the Committee of Imperial Defence would bring about military reforms, preparing Britain for World War I. But relations with Russia were still strained, especially as when the Russo-Japanese War broke out, the Russians sank a British ship, but the Dogger Bank incident did not lead to war between the two nations. Plus, Balfour was sympathetic to the Zionist cause, and opposed to the Tsar's treatment of Jews, and would later sign the Balfour Declaration, promising to create the State of Israel. However, as more Russians fled to Britain, he passed the Aliens Act, restricting the number who could arrive. But as Germany and the USA grew in power, Parliament divided over tariffs. There were the free traders who opposed tariffs, and those who wanted to turn the empire into a closed trading bloc. Balfour wanted to impose tariffs of his own, but this failed as neither side accepted compromise, and the Liberals claimed that conservative tariffs would raise food prices. They also denounced his use of Chinese labourers in South Africa, and the Education Act of 1902, which brought denominational schools into the state system and thus received tax money. So Balfour was forced to resign, and Bannerman became Prime Minister. Bannerman took power in 1905 and quickly ran a very successful election campaign, and had formed a pact with the growing Labour Party. He focused initially on domestic reforms like passing the Workmen's Compensation Act, and the Probation of Offenders Act provided young criminals an alternative to prison. Plus, the recent Boer War highlighted the fact that many in the population were malnourished, as many could not join the army. So free school meals were provided to school children. Internationally, after the Russo-Japanese War, he joined Roosevelt at the Hague Convention and spoke in favour of nations limiting arms. But this largely did nothing as the naval race with Germany continued, and he formed an alliance with Russia. To ease tensions in South Africa, he granted self-government to the Boer states, and this would eventually lead to the Union of South Africa in 1910. And he hoped to take real power away from the House of Lords, but his health turned in 1907, and he had a series of heart attacks. So he resigned, but importantly, he was the first man to be officially called Prime Minister, no longer the First Lord of the Treasury. Asquith assumed the role of Prime Minister, and with Lloyd George, he presented the People's Budget looking to greatly expand social welfare. In order to do so, direct and indirect taxes were increased, including taxes on petrol, tobacco, alcohol, and the likes. This was incredibly controversial, and some described him as socialistic, so it was squashed in the House of Lords, as they argued he didn't have the electoral mandate. As a Liberal, he had inherited a conflict with the House of Lords, so he called for an election in 1910. And despite losing seats to the Conservatives, he formed a coalition with the Irish Parliamentary Party. He had hoped that King Edward VII would, as he supported the budget, grant peerages to Liberals in order to sway the balance of power in Lords. But the King was unwilling to do so because the Liberals did not have an outright majority, but the budget was still passed through Lords that year. The Liberals still, however, wanted to reduce the power of Lords, like their right to veto money bills, and the term of Parliament was reduced from 7 to 5 years. However, Edward died in 1910 and King George V became king, but his position on granting peerages to Liberals was unknown. So again, parliamentary reform was stopped in Lords, so another election was called for in December 1910. This time the Liberals threatened to resign if King George would not grant assurances on creating new Liberal peers. Asquith again won this election with the help of the Irish Party, and the Parliament Bill passed in 1911 thanks to many new Liberal peers filling the House of Lords. Otherwise, to keep the support of the Labour Party, he introduced sweeping social reforms, like introducing pensions and health insurance, and these greatly shifted the focus of the Liberal Party away from Gladstonian classical liberalism. But despite a growing number of people, including some in his cabinet, calling for women's suffrage, he did not push for it. And to keep the support of the Irish nationalists, he put forward the Home Rule Bill of 1914. But this angered the Protestants in Ireland, and they began shipping in arms and preparing for civil war. The bill, however, was passed, and Ireland was going to have its own parliament, but it was delayed due to the outbreak of World War I. Before the war, France had caused an international crisis when they expanded into Morocco. Germany sent ships to Morocco and demanded territorial concessions in Congo if the French would take Morocco unopposed. This they hoped would drive a wedge between Britain and France, but Asquith stood by the French, and Anglo-German relations continued to deteriorate, and both sides continued to expand their navies. And in 1914, when the Central Powers went to war against France and Russia, The British agreed to join the war after Belgium was invaded. His wartime cabinet included Kitchener, Churchill and Lloyd George, but Churchill pushed for the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. Plus, Lloyd George wanted to put all the nation's munitions factory under his control, and he fell out with Kitchener, who still wanted to buy munitions from the current manufacturers. Asquith tried to mediate between the two, but this led to the Shell crisis as he delayed, and Britain was losing battles and his popularity diminished. So he determined his government and party politics could no longer function in the height of war, and a coalition government was formed. This new coalition government brought the production of munitions under the control of the Ministry of Munitions, and it introduced conscription in order to fill the ranks in the front. But the war was not going well, and Douglas Haig was made the new commander, but tens of thousands would die in failed offensives. And in 1916 in Ireland, the Easter Rising broke out in Dublin, and although it was crushed, many were executed afterwards, increasing the calls for independence. Believing Asquith was unable to achieve victory, Lloyd George formed an alliance of sorts with the Conservatives under Bonar Law, and effectively forced Asquith out. Initially a social reformer who helped pass the People's Budget, David Lloyd George's alliance with the Conservatives came as a shock, but his popularity was on the rise thanks to support from Lord Northcliffe, who owned the Times and the Daily Mail. He created a war cabinet to help run the day-to-day handling of the war, including German submarine warfare, and the loss of hundreds of thousands in battles like Passchendaele. Plus, it was around this time that the Balfour Declaration was proclaimed, and Lloyd George pushed for taking Jerusalem and the destruction of the Ottoman Empire. Plus, he was initially happy with the fall of the Tsar in Russia, but the new liberal government in Russia was soon attacked by the Bolsheviks, and Russia exited the war. But the Americans entered the war in 1917, and 500,000 troops were sent to the front to delay the German spring offensive of 1918. However, some of these troops were Irish, as he had just introduced conscription there, causing more resentment within Ireland and eventually the outbreak of the Irish War of Independence. But the Germans still surrendered, and women were given the right to vote the same year, just in time for the 1918 election. The Lloyd George and Bonar Law coalition won a landslide, and he took part in the Paris peace talks. However, Europe at that time was in chaos, and the British became involved in many post-war conflicts. Notably in Ireland, where the bloody independence war ended with the creation of the Irish Free State, partitioning the island. British troops were also deployed to help fight in the Russian Civil War, plus his attempts to support Greece against the Turks in the Turkish War of Independence were thwarted. The Chennac crisis saw dominions like Canada reject involvement in yet another war, so they became even more autonomous. Otherwise, British troops were involved in policing Europe, like in Silesia where the Polish and Germans struggled for control, but ultimately he could do little to stop the many civil wars and the advance of the Bolsheviks. And the United States became an even more dominant power. As Lloyd George and the League of Nations struggled to police the world, the Americans hosted the Washington Naval Conference to limit the number of ships each nation had. Further reforms took place domestically, including raising school leaving age to 14, subsidies for house building, extending the national insurance to 11 million, minimum wage for farm labourers and basic unemployment benefits. But Irish independence, the Chennac crisis and other failures led to the Carlton Club meeting, and the Conservatives agreed to end their coalition with the Liberals. An election was immediately called for, and Bonar Law and his Conservatives won out, beating the two Liberal parties led by Lloyd George and Asquith respectively. But the Labour Party started to make significant gains, becoming the second largest party. Bonar Law was immediately tasked with repaying the American war debts, but the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Stanley Baldwin, agreed to pay more per year than was manageable. So they needed to reclaim debts from other allied nations to pay this back, but his term in office was cut short due to ill health. Baldwin beat Lord Curzon to become the new Prime Minister, and he tried to reduce unemployment through introducing tariffs to protect local industries. And although he had a majority in Parliament, he called for an election to secure a mandate to introduce these tariffs. But he lost a great deal of seats to Labour and the United Liberal Party, so he resigned. The Labour Party under Ramsay MacDonald was invited to form a government and united with the Liberals to do so. Internationally, the French occupied the Ruhr region in Germany, demanding reparations be paid, and the Americans agreed to loan the Germans money to do so. But the Dawes Plan further reduced Britain's authority on the global stage. He also recognised the Soviet Union, but his ties to the communists proved to be his downfall. This is because in the Workers' Weekly, the communists wrote an open letter to the military calling for them to mutiny. MacDonald delayed prosecuting those responsible and lost a great deal of support within Parliament, so his cabinet was dissolved and an election was called for. But just days before the election, the Daily Mail published a fraudulent letter said to be written by the head of the Communist International, and claimed that Labour members and the Soviets would work together in supporting seditious and revolutionary activities. So during the election of 1924, Labour lost 40 seats, but the Liberals, for being in a coalition with Labour, were crushed and lost over 100, cementing their position as the third biggest party. The Conservatives under Baldwin came back into power and signed the Locarno Treaties, a set of non-aggression pacts with the Weimar government in Germany. But he faced many challenges at home, like a general strike in 1926 over dropping wages. Miners' wages were dropping because the British coal industry was threatened by free coal leaving Germany, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, reintroduced the gold standard, making the pound too strong for effective export of goods. The strike was a national emergency, but the Organisation for Maintenance of Supplies filled the roles of those on strike. This was a volunteer body who tried to counter the strikes and unions, but their ranks were filled by many on the right wing and even fascists, and Baldwin's association with the group proved to be incredibly unpopular. He did, however, steer the Conservative Party into accepting the new social welfare state by providing pensions to widows and retired workers, and the voting age of women was reduced from 30 to 21, so the election of 1929 was called the Flapper election. In the aftermath of the strikes and industrial disputes, Labour won the election, gaining over 130 seats, but could only form a minority government with the support of Lloyd George's Liberals. Now in power, the Labour Party cleared slums and provided better housing, and they also increased pay. But he became Prime Minister just as the stock market crash caused the Great Depression. During the Depression, he was unwilling to funnel money into the economy to stimulate spending, as Lloyd George and Oswald Mosley suggested, so Mosley left the party and formed his own, the New Party. As unemployment doubled, MacDonald tried to balance the economy, so began to cut public spending, especially to the unemployed. And he also signed treaties with the Japanese and Americans to limit the size of their navies. But this split Parliament, and in order to steer Britain through the Depression, he formed a national government in 1931, which also consisted of Conservatives and Liberals. Many in the Labour Party were angry about this, huge riots took place, and he was ousted from the party. But in the election of 1931, the new national government won a landslide, the largest ever in British history. Conservatives like Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain took over domestic affairs, many Liberal politicians ran trade, but Labour had few prominent politicians left besides MacDonald. At the Ottawa Conference in 1932, they abandoned the gold standard and abandoned free trade, setting up trade deals with other members of the Commonwealth. And abroad, he continued to try and lead the disarmament movement, signing treaties in Geneva, Lausanne and the likes. But relations with Ireland became strained, and a retaliatory trade war ensued. MacDonald was also in power when the Nazis took over in Germany, and at first he adopted a policy of appeasement. In fact, he signed treaties like the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, bringing the Nazis into the diplomatic concert of Europe. But his health began to decline, even his mental health, and his pacifism came under attack from the likes of Winston Churchill. So he resigned in 1935, allowing Baldwin to take over once again, and Clement Attlee took over the Labour Party. Baldwin took over and secured an electoral mandate in the election of 1935, focusing on trying to tackle unemployment and economic depression. But he was still the head of a national government, one of which included many Liberals and Labour Party members. Some in Parliament, like Chamberlain and Churchill, called for rearmament in the wake of the growing power of the Nazis, but the public largely supported reducing the manufacture of weapons. However, the government still agreed to put money into the Air Force to make sure that they could contend with the growing Luftwaffe. However, nothing was done when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, and the cabinet allowed Mussolini to annex Ethiopia as part of the Hall-Laval Pact. Plus in 1936 the Spanish Civil War erupted, and although Britain did not get involved, many did support a nationalist victory over the communists. Plus Edward VIII became king and proposed to marry Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. She was, as a matter of fact, a supporter of building relations with Germany, so the majority of Parliament, including Baldwin and the Dominions of Canada and Australia, all refused to support the marriage. So the crisis threatened to tear apart the Commonwealth, but only ended when he abdicated the throne for King George VI. Shortly after George VI was crowned, Baldwin stepped down and was succeeded by Neville Chamberlain. Already in his late 60s, Chamberlain was expected to hold the position until the next election, due in 3 years' time. His career was mainly focused on domestic issues beforehand, and now, as Prime Minister, he passed a series of reforms, including the Factories Act to improve working conditions, the Housing Act to encourage more slum clearances and rent control, and the Holidays with Pay Act. Plus, as the Anglo-Irish trade war continued, both sides looked to settle the issue. A settlement was reached when the Irish agreed to give the British access to treaty ports during the war. However, when war came, this meant very little. Chamberlain is, however, best known for his policy of appeasement when dealing with Hitler. He wanted to make the Nazis a stable partner and initially discussed handing Germany back their former colonies. But as the US signed the Neutrality Act and the Soviet Red Army was deemed of limited fighting value, Chamberlain tried to strengthen ties with Mussolini. The Italians, for instance, in exchange for Britain recognising their conquest of Ethiopia, agreed to withdraw some volunteers from the Spanish Civil War. Plus, in 1938 he accepted the Anschluss with Austria, thinking it would drive a wedge between the Italians and Germans. But as the Nazis claimed the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain decided he could do little to help them in the event of an invasion, even though the Czechs had support from the French and even the Soviets. So the British pressured the Czechs to reach an agreement, but when it seemed that Hitler was about to invade, Chamberlain flew to Germany to talk. The Munich Agreement was signed and Hitler was free to annex the Sudetenland, but had to make assurances that he had no more desire to annex further land. Chamberlain returned to a hero's welcome, saying it was going to be peace in our time, yet he still continued the rearmament process. But Hitler continued to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia, so to deter Hitler from further conquests, Britain and France guaranteed Poland's independence and the territorial army was doubled. Then, when the Italians invaded Albania, the British guaranteed the independence of Greece and Romania as well. An alliance with the Soviet Union was attempted, but Poland and Romanians distrusted Soviet troops entering their country, so these talks collapsed. Poland was invaded shortly afterwards and World War II began. Britain's actions in Scandinavia and Germany's annexation of Norway led to the Norway debates, which saw Chamberlain lose a great deal of support and he resigned from his post. Although not popular or trusted by many people in either party, having been both a liberal and conservative, Churchill became the new Prime Minister after Lord Halifax declined the role. But whereas Halifax discussed the idea of a negotiated peace, Churchill did not and gave speeches about fighting a long war with Germany. Shortly after he became Prime Minister, the phony war ended and German forces occupied the Low Countries in France. Some within Parliament like Halifax continued to look to make peace, but Churchill won the cabinet crisis and resolved to fight on, and tried to get the Americans to enter the war on his side. Britain then won the Battle of Britain, stopping an invasion, and once the USA and the Soviets joined the war, the tide of the war turned in Britain's favour. But his term in office during the war was not without controversy. For instance, there was a disastrous famine in Bengal. During the war he had strained relations with the Russians. But he did make the percentages agreement with Stalin, agreeing how much influence the powers would have in the Balkan nations. Plus, after the war, Poland fell under Soviet influence, and Churchill's proposals to divide Germany were rejected. So towards the end of the war, he planned to even go to war against the Soviets as soon as the Nazis surrendered as part of Operation Unthinkable. Of course, this did not happen, and when the war was over, the Labour Party refused to continue the wartime coalition. So with an election looming, he resigned, but ruled over a caretaker ministry until the election. Voters were unconvinced of his post-war economic plans, so Labour won a majority in the 1945 election. The Labour Party set about rebuilding and restructuring the whole economy and welfare in Britain, most importantly creating the NHS. But Attlee also implemented the creation of cradle-to-grave welfare and social security, with the National Insurance Act of 1946, as well as subsidised rents, free milk for school children, free secondary education, assistance for servicemen going to college, family allowances and new pensions, workers' rights and a great deal more. Plus coal mines, the Bank of England, public utilities, railways and a lot more were nationalised. In fact, by the end of Attlee's term, over 20% of Britain's economy was under public ownership, and the vast majority of people were employed. However, the country was still suffering after the war, and Attlee needed to take out loans from the Americans, and rationing continued for years afterwards. While internationally initially welcoming of maintaining good relations with the Soviets, this soon changed as Soviet influence in the Middle East, Eastern Europe and the Far East began to grow. And in 1949 Attlee even sent troops to break up strikes in London docks led by communists, fearing for Soviet influence there. So Attlee joined NATO, and despite splits within the Labour Party, Britain started to develop their own nuclear weapons program. Nevertheless, he did fulfill his promises to leave India, but the partitioning of the subcontinent created a great deal of problems. And he withdrew British troops from Palestine after widespread violence, and the UN took over and they ultimately created the State of Israel. But the fear of the spread of communism and Britain's post-war austerity made him hold onto the African colonies for a while. and by 1950, with rationing of many products still in effect, he lost 80 seats, and with such a small minority he found it hard to govern, so called for another election in 1951. However, he lost even more support because he sent troops to help in the Korean War, which proved to be very costly, so he lost the election to Churchill.